Hey everybody, sorry I'm not able to make it to class today. Unfortunately, I had something that came up, but I didn't want to leave you hanging. I wanted to have a chance to close out our conversation on the executive and the legislative before we start talking about the courts, which is what we're going to do on Friday. So as a brief summary of our discussions, I wanted to take some time to talk a little bit about how Congress and the executive branch interact. And really what I want to focus on is the degree to which the two branches are actually successful in accomplishing their goals. So, for example, you remember that when we stopped talking last time, that we were talking about this idea of how the executive, how the president is or is not capable of acting independently from Congress. And we had several different theories that would explain why power has changed between the two. And the last one we talked about was this idea of principal agent theory. Okay, so what I want to talk about this time is what all of this means. To what degree is Congress or the executive capable of acting on their own independent of the other branch? So there are a couple of different ways that we could think about answering this question. One way is to ask whether or not Congress is capable, members of Congress are capable of achieving their primary goal, which remember we said the primary goal of members of Congress is to try to get reelected. The term that we talk about, or the term that we use when we refer to a person who holds the job and is trying to get it back, the term that we use is incumbent. So are members of the House of Representatives, are members of the Senate successful at achieving incumbency? Well, it turns out that they're actually really pretty good at getting reelected, and they've been getting better at it over time. This slide is an examination of the reelection rates of members of Congress who choose to run for reelection for a 40-year span from 1972 to 2012. 1972 would have been the reelection of Richard Nixon. 2012, of course, the reelection of Barack Obama. Two things should stick out to you on this graph. First of all, you'll notice that for the House of Representatives, while there is some fluctuation, the trend line has been pretty stable. If you're a member of the House of Representatives, if you currently have a job in the House of Representatives, your chances of getting reelected are about 92 to 93%. There have been some election cycles where a sitting member of the House had up to a 95% chance of being reelected, but at no point has it fallen below 85%. Now, admittedly, this number is going to be a little bit skewed by the simple fact that, if I am a member of the House and I know that I'm going to lose, I'm probably not going to run for re-election. But still, members of the House have been very successful over a long period of time at keeping their jobs, which suggests that they've been doing a pretty good job of using the system and at designing the rules of the legislature in such a way that they're likely to be successful. Now, the same thing is true. The second thing you can see on this graph is that the same thing is true for the Senate, but it hasn't just been a consistent thing. Instead, over time, senators have gotten better and better at getting reelected. In 1980, which is the Republican Revolution, Senate reelection rates fell dramatically to about 55%. But except for that period of time, Senate reelection rates have remained fairly relatively stable and have increased from an average of about 75% to a moving average of around 90%, which means that just like in the House of Representatives, senators have been doing a pretty good job at using the rules, using their positions of making sure that they get to keep their jobs. Now, a second way we could answer the same question, are congressmen successful, are congresswomen successful at keeping their jobs, is to think about whether or not they are doing a good job of maintaining control of seats for their parties. Right? Even if I can't get reelected, can I at least make sure that a member from the Republican Party or a member from the Democratic Party will get reelected? This particular chart looks at something that we call the number of marginal seats. A marginal seat is simply one that has a chance of switching political parties from one election to the next, either because of how it's drawn or because of the issues that essentially Republicans or Democrats have a legitimate chance every 2 years of winning control of the seat. Now, back in 1992, which is just 14 years ago, about 100 seats, 103 seats, were considered to be marginal seats, seats that either side had a legitimate chance of winning. Now you'll notice in this chart that Democrats had fewer safe seats than Republicans did. And this is in part because of the strength of the solid Republican South, as well as the greater effectiveness at Republicans to gerrymander, because Republicans controlled more state legislatures. But over time, the number of these marginal seats has collapsed. Both Republicans and Democrats have benefited, but again, you'll notice the Republicans appear to have benefited a little bit more. So today, only about 35 of the members of the House of Representatives are in seats where they would legitimately need to worry about it flipping to the other side. And this number, somewhere between 35 and 60, is probably going to be pretty consistent until the next census, because of how seats are apportioned between the states, but also because of how we understand, or how we see that these seats have been districted. And basically, you're going to have state level redistricting in order to allow some of these seats to be redrawn so that both parties have a legitimate chance of winning. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about it from the congressional perspective. Well, what about from the presidency? How could I ask the question, or how could I examine whether or not the president has the ability to operate independently? Well, one way to think about it is to think about the role of the president when it comes to passing laws. Now, one thing you might want to do is to watch that really cool ABC video. I'm just a bill from the Capitol Hill, or read in your textbook. Do a YouTube search on the video and you can check it out. But if you were to take the process by which a piece of legislation is enacted, and you were to kind of lay it out as a chart, what you can see is that there are several steps in the process. So I could look through at how whichever house that I start in, either be it in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, a piece of legislation has to be introduced. The legislation is going to be referred to a committee and then on to various subcommittees. From there, it's going to be marked up by the committee. It's then going to come down, be voted on by the committee, reported to the full House, where it's going to be read, amendments are going to be applied, and it's going to be voted. Once it passed the House, it then has to pass the Senate in identical forms. And to accomplish that, there's going to be some process by which a conference committee here in the middle will meet between the two. Now, according to this chart, and according to the Constitution, it is then and only then that a piece of legislation is sent to the president, where he can consider whether or not he wants to veto it, or whether he wants to sign it, or if it's at the end of a session, whether or not he just wants to let it die. But as we pointed out, if we think about this process not simply as a process of Congress then acting and then the president, but rather as an interaction between the two, we can see that it's a little bit more complicated than that. In fact, if you were to look at the chart and instead ask, where does the president belong? The president doesn't just simply belong here at the end during the veto phase. Rather, at every step in the process, because the president has the veto, at every step in the process, because Congress may not necessarily understand how they need to enact or enforce a particular piece of legislation, the president's going to be involved in negotiations. And they're going to be negotiating on both sides in the House and the Senate. So here, when you see that the piece of legislation has gone to the committee and is being marked up, the president is going to be negotiating with committee members in both political parties, but especially the ones in the president's own party. And the president's going to tell them, this is what I need in order for this piece of legislation to be signed into law. If you don't give it to me, it's not going to be enacted. If the president has been credible, if he has strong public reputation, if he has strong professional prestige, any piece of legislation that he opposes will die in committee. If it does make it out of committee, then he gets to do this all over again. He gets to negotiate on the floor chamber, or the chamber of the floor, over the piece of legislation. And again, whenever it's being voted on. And again, when it moves over to the other side, from the House to the Senate. And again, as it's going through the committee. And again, until finally, only at the end of the process, does the president have to consider whether or not to issue a veto. So what does this mean? Again, it means that if Congress doesn't really know what they're doing, the president's going to be very influential in these early phases. If the president has a lot of credibility, at each of these 8 or 9 negotiation points, the president will be able to influence the law and kill it if they're opposed to it. If it ever makes to his desk, if it ever requires a veto, it's only because the president has failed to succeed in accomplishing that goal up until that point. So here's kind of where we're going to be going from today. On Friday, when we come back to class, our goal will be to talk pretty quickly, but in enough to understand what's going on, talk about the delegate process and how the president gets elected, both in the party nomination, and then also we'll talk a little bit about the Electoral College. And then from there, after spending maybe 15 or 20 minutes on that, we will then transition into talking about the Supreme Court. As always, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on Friday.